Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a deep breath and wading into a pretty dense but absolutely critical topic.
It's a big one.
It really is. We're looking at the foundational data, the very bedrock of medical negligence law in one of the nation's largest states. Our mission is to give you the ultimate shortcut through, well, decades of legal history.
And to get to the core of a very simple but really powerful argument.
Which is that the entire legal framework might be resting on an empirical record that's, what, nearly 40 years old?
That's the crux of it. The source we're analyzing today is this powerful civic duty white paper. It was written for lawmakers, and its message is basically evidence before action.
Okay, evidence before action, what does that mean in this context?
The authors are arguing, and pretty forcefully, that before the legislature takes any steps to, say, further restrict court access or limit what victims of negligence can recover, they have to just stop.
Stop and do what?
Halt all action and demand a fresh, verifiable, and this is key, impartial reassessment of what's actually happening right now, not 40 years ago.
And to set the stakes for you immediately, we have to talk about the specific law that's really at the heart of this debate.
We do.
It's a statute that severely restricts who can even bring a wrongful death claim after a loved one dies from a medical error.
Precisely. We're talking about Florida's Section 768.218. And the critical thing to understand is that it excludes adult children of elderly parents from bringing a medical wrongful death claim.
Wow. Okay.
And the source paper argues that this specific restriction, and really the whole framework, rests entirely on an empirical review conducted between 1986 and 1988.
So much has changed since 1988. I mean, everything. How hospitals operate, medical technology, insurance, demographics.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack why the authors argue this completely changed landscape makes the original factual foundation obsolete.
And why a new study isn't just a good idea, but maybe even constitutionally required.
It's really an argument about legitimacy. Can you maintain rules that restrict people's rights if the original reason for those rules has, just dissolved? Let's find out.
Okay, let's start by going back. How did Florida get this right in the first place? We have to go back to the mid-1980s.
Right, which was a time of intense friction over medical malpractice. Every stakeholder, every group had a really loud voice in a competing story about a crisis.
So lots of noise.
Ton of noise.
Yeah.
But the real lesson of that 1980s crisis wasn't the crisis itself. It was the methodology they used to respond to it. The Florida legislature realized you can't trust anecdote or rhetoric when everyone is shouting.
So what did they do?
They did something kind of revolutionary for the time. They rejected all the easy fixes, and they commissioned an independent academic task force.
So data first. That decision to get impartial, verifiable data before legislating, that's the standard the white paper is holding up today, right?
Absolutely. And the findings from that 1988 task force are so important because they directly contradicted the popular story of the time.
What did they look at?
Oh, everything. Closed claims, insurer finances, how hospitals reported adverse incidents, verdict patterns. They were looking for hard evidence of a widespread systemic failure that was crippling the entire system.
And what did they find? What was the big moment from that 1988 data?
Well, the data showed the problem wasn't universal at all. In fact, it was incredibly concentrated. The core statistic, and it's still just shocking to read, is this. 4% of Florida physicians accounted for 42% of all paid claims.
Wait, say that again? 4%.
4%.
Of practitioners were responsible for nearly half of all the paid claims. That completely reframes the crisis.
It absolutely does.
It suggests the problem isn't the entire profession or the court system. It's a problem of outliers and oversight.
Exactly. It moved the focus from a systemic issue needing these sweeping profession-wide restrictions to an issue of, targeted regulation and discipline. And that was amplified by another finding. Discipline was failing. The task force reviewed doctors who had multiple paid claims and found that, quote, of the 36 physicians reviewed with multiple paid claims, only 5 had received discipline.
So the state wasn't successfully weeding out the repeat offenders, the very people driving the risk and the cost.
Precisely. If you fail to regulate that small high-risk group, you're basically creating the conditions for a crisis, no matter what the court rules are.
And they also looked at the economics, right? The claims about runaway jury verdicts.
They did, and they debunked them. The task force found that premium volatility was way more complex. It was driven by things like claim severity, how bad the injuries were, and the natural cycles of the insurance industry itself, not just litigation volume.
What about the idea that all the doctors were fleeing the state?
They tackled that too, found no evidence of a mass physician exodus or a collapse in access to care. So the bottom line from the 80s is this. The reforms that followed in 1990, including restrictions like 768.218, were at least built on this verified factual record.
They did their homework. The system at that time met that high bar of evidence before action.
It did.
Okay, now let's fast forward 35 years. The white paper argues we are now just legislating on inertia.
And the transition here is really powerful. The paper notes the author's own personal tragedy, losing their mother to negligence in 2020. But they stress that this paper isn't about looking backward for compensation.
It's about looking forward.
It's about forcing the state to make the system safer for everyone moving forward, based on current verifiable facts.
That shifts the whole focus from victim advocacy to good governance. But if the 1988 task force set the standard, why are we fighting this battle all over again?
Because, and this is the crazy part, the source claims today's debate is a near-perfect mirror of the 1980s. We're hearing the exact same talking points.
Like what?
Doctor flights, skyrocketing premiums, nuclear verdicts driving up costs, all of it. But the critical difference is, in the 80s, the legislature stopped and verified those claims. Today, they're being used to justify action without any updated statewide evidence.
So it's not that the claims are necessarily false, but they are unverified, just like in the 80s.
Exactly. And this is where the legitimacy issue gets really acute. The source points to this warning from the FSU Law Review back in 1988, which basically said that if you pass reforms based on unexamined assumptions, you risk just making things worse.
Solving the wrong problem.
And if you do that with sweeping restrictive laws, you undermine the credibility of the whole legislative process.
And what's wild is that the original task force basically saw this coming. They warned that you couldn't just pass a law and walk away.
They did. They knew healthcare was evolving rapidly, and they explicitly warned that these reforms required continued empirical study to make sure they were still justified. That follow-up, that revaluation, it never happened.
So Florida got steps 1 and 2, write, analyze, then legislate, but they failed on step 3, the essential re-audit.
That's it.
This failure to re-audit brings us to the paper's core constitutional argument, the civic duty to reassess.
Right. The central argument is that the legislature can't just rely on facts from the Reagan administration to justify restrictions on fundamental rights in the 2020s. It just doesn't work.
They have a constitutional obligation to check their work.
A civic and constitutional obligation to verify that the factual predicates, the underlying conditions that justified restricting court access in 1990 still exist today.
Having set that high bar of impartial data in '88, they have to meet that same standard now to keep these restrictive laws on the books.
Precisely. If they want to maintain a restriction like the one in 768.218, they have to prove that the systemic crisis conditions it was meant to solve are still happening. They can't just legislate based on historical inertia or lobbying.
So if they were to do this, what would a modern task force even look at? What are the key things a new, say, 2026 task force would need to figure out?
The proposed scope is incredibly thorough, and it's designed to answer the questions that advocacy groups tend to avoid. It demands empirical foundations.
Okay, like what?
First and foremost, premium and loss trends. But not just for the last few years, for the last 10 to 20 years. That long-term view is critical.
Why is that 2-decade window so important?
Because the insurance market is cyclical. It has peaks and valleys. If you only look at data from a crisis year, it justifies immediate, often drastic action. A 20-year review shows if the market is truly collapsing or just in a normal hard cycle.
That makes a lot of sense. What about the doctor flight argument?
That has to be empirically verified, too.
Yeah.
Track physician migration by specialty and by region. If neurosurgeons really are fleeing South Florida, okay, that's a fact you can legislate on. But if the data shows 96% of doctors are staying put,
Then the argument loses its power.
it loses its legislative weight. And they also need to bring back a crucial piece from the '88 review, auditing the state's own enforcement.
Checking on how they're disciplining doctors.
Yes. They have to look at DOH disciplinary consistency for repeat offenders. This connects right back to that 4% of doctors driving 42% of claims. If the state still isn't consistently disciplining the outliers, then the problem is internal regulatory failure.
Not the tort system.
Right. And restricting court access in that case just ends up shielding the repeat bad actors.
And the list goes on, right? There are system-wide things they need to measure.
Absolutely. Things like hospital adverse event reporting. Are hospitals being honest about errors? And access to care. If these restrictions are supposed to increase access, then show us the data. Show us that access has actually improved in rural or low-income areas.
And then finally, they have to look at the law itself. Does 768.218 actually work?
That's the ultimate gut check. A modern task force has to ask, does this law produce any measurable public benefit in safety or affordability? If it protects insurers but doesn't make patients safer or lower premiums, its legitimacy is it's gone.
And the paper suggests they should also look at other states.
Yes, specifically places like Michigan, which have disclosure and learning models that focus more on preventing errors in the first place, rather than just restricting remedies after someone is already hurt.
You know, this level of verification seems to create benefits for everyone. It's not about picking a side.
It's not. For patients, it means safety reforms are based on actual causes. For physicians, it gives them clarity and protects the vast majority by identifying the few outliers.
And for the big players, the insurers, the hospitals.
Insurers get transparent baselines, which reduces market uncertainty. And lawmakers, crucially, get defensible constitutional policy that's grounded in current, auditable facts. It restores public trust.
Okay, now let's get to the sharp legal edge of this.
Yeah.
The paper argues that resting on old data doesn't just make for bad policy. It makes the law constitutionally vulnerable.
This is the constitutional contingency. When a state restricts a fundamental right, like access to the courts, the judiciary often relies on the factual record, that crisis data, to uphold the law as a rational response.
And past court decisions have done that.
Right. A case like Mizrahi v. North Miami Medical Center from 2003, it implicitly relied on the 1988 factual record to uphold these restrictions.
So the law stands because the court assumes the facts from 1990 are still true today.
Exactly. But if the material conditions have changed, if the crisis that justified the law 35 years ago is over, then the factual predicate is gone. The foundation has crumbled, and the statute becomes vulnerable to legal challenges that it's arbitrary or unreasonable.
It's like building a retaining wall for a flood, but 30 years later, the river has permanently changed course. The wall is still there.
But the reason for it is gone. That's a perfect analogy. And the source argues really forcefully about where the burden of proof lies here.
It's on the state.
It's on the state, or whoever's asserting the need to keep these restrictions. If the state wants to preserve 768.21, it has to proactively demonstrate with current, impartial evidence that the conditions from 1990 still exist today.
They can't just wave their hands and say, trust us, the crisis is still on.
Correct. And the only constitutionally sound way to do that is with a comprehensive, impartial task force that meets the same high standard Florida itself set back in 1988. If the state refuses to audit the facts, it's basically admitting the restriction lacks a current factual justification.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? The central message here is really about governance accountability. Florida set the gold standard in the 80s, analyze the facts, then legislate. But they missed the most crucial step for long-term responsibility.
The systematic reevaluation. They failed to re-audit as circumstances inevitably changed. They treated a dynamic system as if it were static.
And the authors offer a really powerful analogy to wrap this all up. It's about civic duty.
Yeah, they say the people of Florida stand to the state as shareholders stand to a corporation. Those who grant the authority to the citizens can demand an audit of the assumptions being used in their name. This isn't a political demand. It's a factual audit of governance.
A factual audit is the only way to ensure legitimacy. So, since evidence is so key to defensible policy, here's a provocative thought for you to chew on. If this specific statute, which restricts fundamental access to the courts, is resting entirely on a decades-old factual record that's never been formally audited, what other long-standing restrictive laws in your state might be resting on equally outdated assumptions? That is the real consequence of legislative inertia.